I'm gonna give reasons for a certain attitude towards this topic rather than a precise view of it. Here is a brief plan of what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna present this distinction and its role in several metaphysical debates. I'm going to consider a case that has been done by Sam Cowling for taking this distinction as primitive and not analyzable. And I'm going to argue against Sam Cowling's argument in this sense by considering which desiderata he puts on the distinction and which desiderata I think should instead put on it, basically. And then I'm going to suggest that if I am right, we should take an attitude towards this distinction that maybe is not really a form of instrumentalism. We will see in the end what's the best name for it. So first of all, what I'm not gonna talk about. My topic is not qualitativeness in the sense of what contrasts with quantitativeness. Here is a quote from Il Saggiatore by Galileo. Galileo here is speaking against what he calls secondary properties, but basically the idea is that for him, qualities, in as much as they cannot be measured, are not something that is real and that we should trust. Anyway, this is not my topic, so let's just set it aside from the start. What is my topic? Well, it's this distinction between qualitative and non-qualitative. It's a distinction that is usually drawn as applied to properties and or relations, or facts, or propositions in certain cases. Here we have a classical quote in this concern by Robert Adams. In this paper from 1979, Adams deals with this topic and says that we might try to capture the idea of this distinction by saying that, sorry, I cannot see it on my screen, I have to look there. We might try to capture the idea by saying that a property is purely qualitative, a suchness, if and only if it could be expressed in a language sufficiently rich without the aid of such referential devices as proper names, proper adjectives and verbs, such as Leibnizian and Pegasizes, indexical expressions, referential uses of definite descriptions. This is a rough characterization of what he has in mind, but of course it's a characterization that bases the distinction on linguistic considerations, and not everybody is happy with this. So a second stab at this idea is the following, still by Adams. Oh, why didn't it? So it's, okay, thanks. All the properties that are in certain senses general. There's something strange. My connection is not too good. Okay, this is the slide. So Adam says this is another way to give an idea of what I have in mind by this distinction. All the properties that are, in certain senses, general, capable of being possessed by different individuals, and non-relational are suchnesses. More precisely, let us say that a basic suchness is a property that satisfies the following three conditions. It is not a thisness. By thisness, it means something like the property of being a certain individual in particular, like the property of being Robert Adams or Jan. So it is not a thisness in this sense, and is not equivalent to one. It is not a property of being related in one way or another to one or more particular individuals. 3, a basic suchness is not a property of being identical with or related in one way or another to an extensionally defined set that has an individual among its members, or among its members' members, or among its members', etc. And then he says, let us define a suchness is a property that is either a basic suchness, in the sense just mentioned, or constructed out of basic suchnesses by what he calls logical or epistemic operations. Basically, what he has in mind is that if we have a suchness, let's say being red, and another suchness being blue, we can construct a non-basic suchness of being red and blue. And these are the logical operations he has in mind, things of this sort, like conjunction, disjunction, etc. For epistemic operations, he means something like being known to be blue, being believed to be red, etc. So, and now, so this was basically Adams about qualitative properties, and normally the distinction is usually is taken to be mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive. So, everything that does not respect this characterization would be a non-qualitative property. This is the idea. Here are a couple of examples. Having married twice a famous movie star who got married 8 times would count as a qualitative feature, while having married Liz Taylor twice would count as a non-qualitative feature. Of course, the distinction is very familiar from all the literature on counterexamples to the principle of the identity of indiscernibles. So like when we speak about black spheres, what we usually have in mind is that the two spheres share all the qualitative properties and relations, and the only ways in which they differ is by having certain non-qualitative properties and entertaining certain non-qualitative relations. Now, for the role that this distinction has played in debates in metaphysics, one example is, and I owe this to Jan because I was not very familiar with this literature, with this part at least of this literature before knowing of it through him. So the distinction, or a certain distinction, the idea of certain predicates being qualitative and certain not, was used to defend inductive reasoning against Goodman's new riddle of induction. And so in looking for what would be, as opposed to Goodman's famous Gru and Blin, etc., projectible predicates. So the idea was that as long as we have predicates that are purely qualitative, we can trust that they're not gonna betray us in the way that Gru, Blin does, etc., and they can allow us to draw inductive conclusions. So here is Goodman about it. After having considered these examples of non-projectible predicates, he says the most popular way of attacking the problem takes its cue from the fact that accidental hypotheses, so accidental hypothesis would be something like all emeralds are Blin. So accidental hypotheses seem typically to involve some spatial or temporal restriction or reference to some particular individual. They seem to concern the people in some particular person's desk, while law-like hypotheses characteristically concern all ravens or all pieces of copper whatsoever. Complete generality is thus very often supposed to be a sufficient condition for law-likeness. And the idea would be that purely qualitative predicates would be the one that convey this idea of complete generality. The distinction has, of course, a crucial role for the debate on modal excitism, which was defined by Lewis as follows. So Lewis, on the plurality of words, tells us that there are two ways for words to differ. Words can differ qualitatively, and words can differ in what they represent the re of certain individuals. And then he says, if two words differ in what they represent the re concerning some individual, but do not differ qualitatively in any way, I shall call that an exatistic difference. Exatism, as I propose to use the word, is the doctrine that there are at least some cases of exatistic difference between words. Anti-exatism is the doctrine that there are none. And finally, the debate that led me to deal with the qualitative distinction is the one on qualitativism, or as I prefer to call it, following an old paper by Kit Fine, metaphysical anti-exatism. And this is a debate that was brought to the attention of contemporary metaphysics by Robert Adams. This is from the same paper I mentioned before. Adams introduced this debate with the following question: is the word, and are all possible words, constituted by purely qualitative facts, or does thisness hold the place beside suchness as a fundamental feature of reality? And the idea would be that metaphysical anti-exatists hold that the former is the case, so that by and large, reality is fundamentally qualitative, while metaphysical exatists hold that the latter is the case. So there is some sense of fundamental suchness. Okay. I forgot to say, please interrupt me if I say something strange or you cannot follow, etc. Now, so can we characterize this distinction? Can we give a characterization that is satisfactory? We saw earlier this first attempt of Adams to give at least an idea of it, although Adams was clear in saying that he would have been satisfied also with taking the distinction as primitive. And then can we characterize it? Well, there's a question, and another question is, can we really give an analysis of it? Now, and I think Jan would say that, yes, we can. Sam Cowling argued that we can. How did he do this? Well, he basically considered several strategies for an analysis of the distinction. He calls them the linguistic view, the modal view, the grounding view, the definability view, and the supervenience view. So the first one would be something like what we saw earlier, considered by Adams. So the idea that we can characterize, like analyze the distinction in terms of certain linguistic features of basically the way we express different properties. The modal view would analyze it in terms of certain modal connections between certain properties and certain entities, like certain individuals. The grounded view would have it that certain properties, the non-qualitative ones, are grounded in certain specific individuals, and so on. Anyway, this is not, I'm not gonna focus on the details of these proposals. What's important for me is that basically Cowling considers them, and then he finds them all wanting, all unsatisfactory. And he says, well, okay, so the safest bet is to take the distinction as primitive, to think that we cannot analyze it. And here is what he says. He says, all extant reductionist proposals are inadequate, so primitivism about the distinction is our best remaining option. Although we are reluctant primitivists, this commitment to primitivism should not be viewed as a kind of philosophical defeat. To be sure, boiling down concepts and distinctions to other concepts and distinctions, so what someone who analyzes the the distinction we want to do is a profitable undertaking, but ensuring that we have the proper primitive concepts or distinctions is no less important. Well, I'm not positively against the idea that the distinction should be taken as primitive. So I don't positively think that we can analyze it or we should analyze it. Rather, my point against Cowling here will be that he's asking too much. So that primitive he ends up accepting is not a primitive concept that is actually usual for some of the debates that we saw to make use of some distinction between qualitative and non-qualitative. I'm gonna explain myself better now. So I am agnostic about whether or not the distinction can be analyzed, but I think that Cowling's reason for claiming that the distinction cannot be analyzed is wrong-headed. How so? Well, I think that basically what Cowling does is lumping together too many understandings of the distinction that are actually, although going under the same or similar names, are actually different, too different and too diverse. And that by doing this, basically, Cowling bestows too many diverse desiderata on the distinction. So he might be right in concluding that the distinction he's after resists reductive analysis. But then he is wrong in holding that that distinction that he considers is the one that is relevant for any of the metaphysical debates that I mentioned earlier, which are, to recall these three debates, so the one on the new riddle of induction, the one of modal excitism, and the one on metaphysical anti-excitism. Now, this is yes, basically what he does, Cowling takes it that the distinction should be one that plays all these roles by itself. But I argue that it's not the case. So the desiderata that these different debates set on the distinction cannot be satisfied by one philosophically interesting distinction in itself. An example is, so the debate, we consider the debate on induction and the debate on metaphysical anti-excitism or qualitativism. And what I'm going to argue is that the desiderata set forth by these debates pull in different directions. And so the distinction that is, or that would be relevant in the debate on induction in particular, is radically different from the one that is relevant for the debate on metaphysical anti-excitism. How to appreciate this case, this fact? Well, let us consider, for instance, the debate on metaphysical anti-excitism and what the distinction should do in that debate. Now, as I mentioned earlier, metaphysical anti-excitism and anti-exitists defend the idea that everything about reality basically is either qualitative or somehow determined by the qualitative character of reality itself. Why? Well, their argument for this is typically based on the idea that if this were not true, so if it were not the case that everything about reality is either qualitative or determined by the qualitative character of reality, then there would be cases that they find unacceptable. How so? This would be basically cases where situations differ merely as concerns the identity of the things involved in them and do not differ in any other way. In particular, they will not differ qualitatively. here is an example of this attitude. So this is Leibniz in his correspondence with Clarke. And Leibniz says, so what he's doing here is arguing for the identity of indiscernibles in order to argue against absolute space. And he says it is impossible, there should be a reason why God, preserving the same situations of bodies among themselves, should have placed them in space after one certain particular manner and not otherwise. Why everything was not placed the quite contrary way, for instance, by changing east into west. So what's the idea? The idea is that if there were absolute space, points of space would be indiscernible individuals, basically, considered completely apart from the things that occupy them. They would be indiscernible. And if there were such things, God would be faced with having to choose between possibilities that are indiscernible qualitatively and differ only in which thing is where, basically. So which thing occupy which position of space. And this is the example of the idea of changing completely east into west and keeping everything as just the same as it is. And this is unacceptable for Leibniz, of course. Another example of a case for a form of metaphysical anti-Hexitism, this is Shamik Dasgupta, who thinks that we should hold on to a form of metaphysical anti-Hexitism. Why? Because those differences that I mentioned, those differences that merely concern the identity of things, basically are not cannot be detected with our best physical theories. In particular, according to him, cannot be detected with the help of any theory from Newton to this day, and cannot contribute to our knowledge of reality. So here is the example he gives. He says, primitive individual called Peter is at an initial time, t0, propelled up in the air by a slingshot, only to fall by gravity back to Earth. And now consider a different system whose initial state at t0 differs only in the fact that a different primitive individual pole is slung. By hypothesis, he says, we are to suppose that Peter and Paul have the same mass, shape, charge, and so on. If the two systems both obey Newtonian gravitational theory, then Paul will make exactly the same trajectory through space as Peter. According to Newtonian gravitational theory, the identity of each particle makes no difference to how the slingshot or the Earth's gravitational field affect it. So I think this is exactly the crucial point in this sort of debate. The idea is that non-qualitative features of reality, whatever they are, facts or properties or propositions, etc., they face us with this, if they're not always grounded or supervening, etc., on qualitative ones, they face us with these cases where the identity of things in itself would make a difference. And according to some, in particular, according to those who argue for metaphysical anti-Hexitism, this is unacceptable. And I think that in this debate, this is the point that the qualitative distinction, the distinction between qualitative and non-qualitative should capture. So this is what I think about this. In that debate, the distinction should be one that tells apart among the items of a certain class. So could be properties or facts or propositions, etc. Those that involve the identity of some given entities. So this would be the non-qualitative, and the others, all the others would be the qualitative. This distinction, more precisely, is often called the distinction between pure and impure. And what I think is that for this debate, this is exactly the only relevant distinction, basically. Again, a couple of examples. In this sense, the property of loving Sachmo would be non-qualitative in this sense, and the property of loving someone, by contrast, would be qualitative. If the distinction is applied to facts, then we would have to say that the fact that Sachmo is playing the trumpet is non-qualitative, while the fact that someone is playing the trumpet is qualitative. But what about instead the debate on Goodman's? Do I still have time? I don't know how long I've been talking. Okay, thanks. So what about the debate on Goodman's new riddle of induction? Well, the appeal to the distinction by those like Carnap who wanted to answer to object against Goodman was made with something completely different in mind, I think. So the idea there was to gain some sort of generality, and then and the idea was that this would give us good reasons to hope that we will end up with projectable predicates. So for instance, of course, this is the classical case. The idea would be that being blue is general. It doesn't make reference to a time of observance or to an observer in particular, etc. And so it has the generality that being blue does not have. And the same for being green as opposed to being blind. Just wanted to go quickly back to, no, I cannot do that. Yes. So as a matter of fact, this idea of generality, for instance, was in this is also something that Adams mentioned, and indeed Adams is somebody who wanted to use the distinction in order to talk about metaphysical anti-excitism and excitism. But I simply think he was wrong there. Generality, I think, is not relevant, really, in the sense of generality, the capacity to be possessed by different individuals for a property. This is not really, I think, something that is relevant for the debate on metaphysical excitism. But we'll get there. So I think we were here. Yes. Okay. So now it is actually easy. So we said that the interesting distinction for the debate of metaphysical excitism is the one between pure and impure. So the ones that, in some sense, involve the identity of things, and the ones that not. While in the other case, in the case of the debate on induction, the point would be to have a distinction that characterizes qualitative features as perfectly general. But the thing is, it is very easy to find examples of features that are pure without being general, and also others that are general without being pure. Here's an example of the first case. I owe it to Jan Plate, basically. I mean, this is something we discussed, and it was also, yes, it's also in this book by Cohen. Well, the feature of being blue when observed for the first time and green afterwards, well, this is pure. There's no mention whatsoever of the identity of certain things in particular, but it's not general. Yes, I mean, it doesn't have the generality that is desired by this by Carnap and others who were trying to defend induction reasoning from Goodman's Riddle. And consider, for instance, the feature of having feel as an ancestor, where feel is a certain particular groundhog. Okay, so this feature would be impure, but suppose that, as a matter of fact, all groundhogs descend from one and the same groundhog ancestor feel. So I know this sounds very weird, but I heard some scientists say that this is the case for us human beings. Like we actually, all of us who are alive now, we all descend from the same woman in Africa. So it may sound exotic, but it's not that absurd a case. Well, this would be an impure feature. But of course, those who are trying to argue against Goodman's riddle of induction would want it to be projectable, I think. Now, I said that I would have motivated a form of instrumentalism. I'm not sure this is the right term. Maybe proper instrumentalism about the distinction would be what Goodman himself not defended, but stated when he said that, as a matter of fact, yes, we can start with the blue and green and explain GRU and Blin through blue and green and a temporal term. And that's the idea, is that it's what he did when he faced us with this counterexample. But what he said was, yes, okay, but we can also, as a matter of fact, start with GRU and Blin and then define blue and green in terms of GRU and Blin and a temporal term. So in this sense, basically, green would apply to emeralds examined before T, just in case they are Blin. So, yes, not just in case they are GRU, and to other emeralds, just in case they are Blin. That's the idea. And so Goodman concludes that qualitativeness is an utterly relative matter. Here's what he says. I couldn't paste the quote here because it was a weird format, my file, but he said, thus qualitativeness is an entirely relative matter and does not by itself establish any dichotomy of predicates. This relativity seems to be completely overlooked by those who contend that the qualitative character of a predicate is a criterion for its good behavior. Now, this is not, so I'm not as extreme as to think the way Goodman does in this concern, but my idea is, so what I want to support rather is maybe what Cowling called a form of deflationism. When Cowling considers the definability view, which would analyze qualitative properties in terms of Lewis's perfectly natural properties, he says, if the definability view is understood as merely stipulating a conception of qualitative for a limited range of purposes, there is little reason to worry about whether it succeeds in its reductive ambitions. So yes, my idea is that the right attitude would be to think that for a certain theoretical purpose, we might want to define a certain qualitative distinction. And maybe that's not the same qualitative distinction, qualitative, non-qualitative distinction that would be relevant for other purposes. And that's basically it. Thanks a lot.